Hello, and welcome to the Responsive Family Sleep Podcast. I'm your host, Kim Hawley, holistic sleep coach, lactation consultant, peaceful parenting educator, and mom. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by all the conflicting sleep info, frustrated with sleep information that just plain felt wrong, or searched desperately for a truly gentle and responsive sleep approach, then you are in the right place. In each episode, we'll be answering your most pressing baby and toddler sleep questions, busting those sleep myths, and helping you understand truly developmental, biologically normal baby and toddler sleep, plus encouraging you to trust your intuition along the way. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to this week's podcast episode. I am so excited. It's taken a little bit to get us here, and I've been very excited for this episode this week. We are going to be talking all about nurture and neuroscience and all the valuable work we do with our littles when we are responding to them. So I have a guest, Greer. I'm so excited to have you here chatting with me. Let's start off by sharing a little bit about yourself for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with your work already.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your awesome podcast. I'm so happy to be here. So my background is in neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience and medical science from the University of Toronto, and I did postdoctoral work at Columbia University and lots of other trainings at NYU and Yale. Once I decided to get into working with parents and babies, I was like, I need even more theoretical foundation. So I've done lots of training, lots of learning, understanding how our brains develop, how genetics and experience work together, kind of in a dance to build our brain, build our mind, build the foundations for mental health, physical health, wellness, and all these wonderful things we wish for our babies. And after that academic training, I became a birth and postpartum doula and a mother as well, a beautiful little boy. And we now, in my work, kind of just bring all that work together, right? That also that art dance of like the art and science and integration into people's real lives of nurture, and try to help people nurture as much as they can.
Yeah. It's different when you live it, right? With your own kiddo, as opposed to learning it. I mean, I think people can support wonderfully before becoming a parent, but when it's like your reality and all of a sudden you're like, I'm living everything that I've learned and taught, I think that's always really cool.
Yeah, completely. It kind of just, is that last piece of, forming that foundation of practice, right? I mean, I agree. I think people can work beautifully with parents and babies if they don't have their own children, but I think you have that extra piece of like understanding quite, how hard it can be, quite how draining it can be, like all of those kinds of feelings, and also the beautiful feelings, like how magical and incredible that the experience is.
And holding those two sometimes conflicting things at the same time in your heart and your head, like this is so brutal and hard, and this is so beautiful and important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I actually want to start off maybe a little bit of a brief chat about that interplay between genetics and experience, just for people who maybe aren't as familiar with that kind of dance. I love that you said that. As far as what's happening in these early years with our little ones.
Yeah. I think that, there's that popularized nature versus nurture debate. And it has been pretty much, decided on with the amount of research we have now that, most traits, most parts of personality, stress, temperament, all these things that people are kind of speculating on, and also health, are a very complicated interplay of both genetics and experience. So for anything we're interested in, it's usually about a 50% contribution of both. And the genetic component, we have no control over or influence over. We have the genes we have that we pass on. So does our partner, our husband, and then our ancestors' genes are all in that mix as well. And then we do have influence over the environmental part to degrees, right? Not full influence, But the fact that we can influence about 50% of development is incredible. Absolutely incredible. There's an old saying that I don't like it. I think we need to think of something better because it's actually pretty violent, but that genetics loads the gun and experience either pulls the trigger or doesn't
That
pull the
makes sense.
trigger.
But
So,
yeah.
in the neuroscience labs that we studied, a lot of both physical and mental health, like mental, struggles and illnesses. Um, if we, engineered our experiments so that animals would have genetic predispositions to different diseases, we could say if they grew up in a high nurture environment, there would be almost no expression of that illness. And if the
Mm.
animals grew up in a lower nurture environment, there would be a much higher expression in the population of the illness. So there's a huge, huge interaction.
Yeah, so the predisposition and then the environment creates a lot of whether it's expressed or not expressed or how it's expressed.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I love that you landed on that piece there because I think I want to say it may be you or the first person who I heard years back talk about us having a low nurture culture. Not that the concept was unfamiliar, but just having it phrased in that way, which I think is so
Hmm.
important. And so let's talk a little bit about what that means that we live in a low nurture culture.
I had this incredible conversation last night about this that has actually inspired me even more. It was someone who's more really interested in history and animal behavior and things like that, and also human nature as well, but not
Mm-hmm.
in this field of like babies and everything too. And they were sort of talking about how the love between a mother and a baby is like the most powerful force on earth, and especially the most powerful force for good on earth.
Mm.
And I love that. I'm so happy to talk about it here to like kind of unpack this conversation.
Yes.
And I'm like, I know that, and I've heard it so many times, but it just hit in a really beautiful and like important way last night. And my response to that was yes, absolutely. Especially when you have experienced that as a mother,
Mm-hmm.
like nothing can compare to how miraculous, awe-inspiring, the depths of love, the depths of connection, the depths of beauty that is that relationship between a mother and a baby, and
Mm-hmm.
fathers and babies too. I can just speak as a mother. And then I sort of said to him, well, think about this low nurture culture that we're in. There are so many forces that are trying to disrupt that relationship between mothers and babies. They're shaming it. They are telling mothers that they're wrong, and that innate behavior, that intuition is wrong, and
Mm-hmm.
just doing so many things to interrupt it. And then it really dawned on me, like, I've been saying all this stuff, but it just even more powerful. It's like living in this low nurture culture where you're disrupting the most beautiful thing that we know exists on earth, of course, has horrible effects for
Mm-hmm.
every single facet of society. And that's been my message, is like, what if we can flip, at least as in our small enough ways in our own personal lives, to just increase that nurture a little bit more, help boost, mothers and fathers to be able to nurture their babies, to be able to bring more of this like unbelievable relationship to flourish in the world. What are the effects of that, right? It's I think the most important thing, that we can do.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating. We think about framing our culture as low nurture, which totally is, and then like digging into that history of sleep training, being in at least in the baby space, that one of the loudest voices to not nurture, right? And you just think about all these components that come together that have nothing to do with how you instinctually would interact with a baby or how most of the world interacts with babies,
Mhm.
at least until we export our terrible development and it seems good and modern to act like Western
Yeah.
culture, which is never good. It's so these pieces that we culturally take for granted are normal are so not normal, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that came up too because oh, mom and baby and dad are also part of it, right? Like there's this overwhelming feeling that we have as mothers, and this has become so much more like forefront in my mind as well, hosting some support groups right now, facilitating them. And mothers are feeling so lonely, so unsupported. We know this, right?
Yep.
Every mother will most likely would say that unless they're an exception. And they want to be mothered too. They're feeling like that need, like I need to be mothered
Yes.
while I'm mothering.
Yes.
And so that's part of the low nurture culture as well, is like starving moms of nurture and kind of influencing them not to be nurturing to babies as well. And it's really harmful, and we need to increase nurture. I know one
Yeah.
thing is true in life. That's it.
Because when we think about it, we should be in these intergenerational communities where we're getting nurtured by the aunties and the grandmas as we then nurture our babies and our young children, right? Like it should be that we grew up being nurtured, and then when we're a parent, we're still getting nurtured by that generation, like
Absolutely.
and then we're nurturing our baby, right? I mean, that's sort of the interplay that it should be. To be able to nurture, you need to be nurtured.
And that is happening in other places in the world where
Mm-hmm.
mothers will often move back in with their parents,
Mm-hmm.
and they will draw them baths, they'll make them food, they will like make sure they're comfortable and cared for, and that isn't happening in low nurture culture. Absolutely not. Yeah.
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 How would you define a high nurture culture? Or like, what would you envision? We think about like, what is this optimal conditions? Um, Knowing that we don't have full control over how our culture operates, but like,
Absolutely.
what are we striving towards?
Yeah, we can kind of try to get, like I said, as much as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so yeah, I mean the outer layer, I always think of like the babies in the middle of the circle, and then the nurture layer around them are their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then around them could be family, friends, community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and starting from the outside in, right? Having family, friends, and community, and or hiring people like postpartum doulas and birth doulas,
Mm-hmm.
um, to support the emotional experience of parents. It's still a foreign thing, right? Like I'm a birth and postpartum doula as well. Like people are like, why would anyone need you? Like, what's that about? And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's becoming more obvious now. I think
Yeah.
more people are talking about their birth experiences and whether they had support or not. But having an emotional support through your pregnancy, birth, postpartum is necessary, for it to, be, a place of health, right, to grow from
Mm-hmm.
after. And if not, like if lacking, right, it's going to be a place of illness, like
Yep.
very much likely, right, mental and
Yep.
physical. So yeah, really helping parents understand that, and healthcare systems and all kinds of structures. Like we have to build that for parents as much as possible. And that can come in so many different forms. But for them to I always think of it as like who's putting energy into the parents, who's like asking them how they're doing, who's, helping them
Mm-hmm.
out with things that they need, and just, giving them some love and care is a really important layer. And then for the parents, that can free them up quite a bit emotionally and physically to be able to be nurturing to their babies. So, being really physically close and an intimate, like physical relationship, as well as an emotional relationship, really understanding babies' communication, cues, and showing up for them. It can be as simple as that.
Yeah. Who is it? Someone, I forget who. It's like it's that simple and it's that hard, right? I
Yeah,
think you
Carly
make it.
Grubb.
Okay, yes.
That's the
So one of the names out there that I know all the time. I'm terrible at connecting to quotes, right? Like it is. It's so
it is.
simple, but it can be so hard. Um,
Absolutely.
to do that and to show up, especially within our low nurture culture where we're not all getting that
Mhm.
support.
Completely. And also in our low nurture culture where no one is freed up for that support.
Mm-hmm.
maybe we do have family. A lot of people don't have family close to them or close friends necessarily when they have their baby. But sometimes we do, but our parents are still working because
Mm-hmm.
now people aren't really retiring for, a really long time in many cases. And then, right, the same, our aunts, our sisters, our sister-in-laws, like the people who would show up, they're all booked
Yeah.
by this culture too. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's tough.
Because we want productivity and busyness, right? That's the best thing ever.
Hmm.
Just doesn't mesh very well with nurture and early parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you asked me before, what would nurture look like? I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
best thing I could think of is that we could give parents that option to be home as much as possible in those first 3 years of the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Other countries do this. They have,
Yep.
if there's two parents, they split that time. In
Mm-hmm.
Canada, now we have 12 to 18 months leave for one parent. We could give it to both parents, and that would cover the first 3 years, right? If they want
Mm-hmm.
to. A lot of parents also want to go back to work at a certain point, and that's fine too. But to have that choice,
Yeah.
fantastic.
And I would think the flexibility with work wouldn't make sense with someone's job that it doesn't have to be you away from your baby for 40, 50 hours a week, right?
Yes.
In order to use that side of your brain, that piece of your identity, which I feel like some people can make work, but I see a lot of people struggling, right? To kind of mesh that, even when they do want to be still engaged in a career at this period.
Mhm.
Not even like it's not a choice financially, like it might be a choice financially, but they want to be present in that professional setting. But there are ways that it can be done much more healthfully, I feel like, for new parents versus our parents, that 0 to 3 age versus not.
Absolutely. So there's so many creative ways to think about it. But yeah, you're right, because our brains change so much postpartum, so much in those early years.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really, really wired for that, you know, listening, hearing our babies, responding to our babies, thinking about our babies, thinking about 10 steps ahead for our babies, maybe even more. Um, and it is really challenging for a lot of people. I can't speak for everyone to use that brain, to go back to work really quickly and be doing tasks that aren't necessarily suited to that kind of brain
Mm-hmm.
state. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Sort of related because since you said the first 3 years, and I know I've heard you say this a lot, and I've heard other folks sort of from the neuroscience angle say this a lot, but this idea that the infancy for the brain is the first 3 years. And I will fully admit, the first time I heard that, the public health professional in me was like, no, it's infancy and then toddlerhood. That's, you get these things ingrained in your system and it's like nails on a
Or
chalkboard. And then you're like, wait, no, that's stupid. Of course. Like that makes perfect sense from a neuroscience perspective. But I would love for you to just unpack that a little bit.
Oh, I'm so happy you brought it up because honestly, I was like scared to say it publicly for a very long time because of how drastic that changes for people's
Yes.
minds. Like I didn't want to scare anyone away from nurture, but by saying that, because the baseline in the low nurture culture is sometimes it's like, well, they're a baby for 4 months.
God,
Then
yes.
take away all the supports. They're a baby for 6 months. They're a baby for 12 months is the most generous, usually. It's,
Mm-hmm.
oh, first birthday's over, no longer a baby,
Yep.
go on, right? And of course they learn to crawl and walk, and that, toddler kind of falls into that too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it is 3 entire years in terms of how rapidly the brain's developing and how flexible and susceptible their emotional brain that forms mental health is in those first 3 years, right? And the emotional maturity of
Mm-hmm.
our little ones, right? And in psychology, infancy is defined up to age 5.
I guess that makes sense, right? That's early childhood is usually up through age 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's different lenses will have different kind of trajectories, but it's not going to be as little as a year, right? And
Yep.
I think the reason why it's hard to, I think people get it now, but it was hard for me to kind of be really upfront with it in the beginning when I started communicating that, it requires such a big mindset shift. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I love that. I love that you said that, right? Like it was literally the like little organizer of definitions in my brain that was cringing because I have a public health background. And so, so much of that comes to definitions around like what phase are we in? Even though as soon as I sat back and kind of processed it a moment, I was like, oh, well, duh. Like I already know 0 to 3 is like this unique time. So phrasing it this way makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
when you really start to think about it. But
Yeah.
I love that you said susceptible, right? Like the flexibility about the susceptibility of that emotional, um, mental health, stress, all those systems and interconnected pieces. So I would love if you just take a few minutes and expand on that, like what we're doing, because we say a lot with attachment and with neuroscience, right? That the foundation for future mental health is laid down in infancy. And so will you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think the other thing that I was thinking while you were just asking the question is, I was thinking of like the parent hearing this, right? And sometimes it can feel really scary and overwhelming because
Yes.
it is so important, 0 to 3. And there's so many like nuances to that. And I think parents kind of know that from what's out there in general, right? They might be hearing it for the first time here, but you know, parents know that there is already a lot of anxiety about giving babies a certain experience between 0 to 3. And it looks like buying the right equipment, and getting into the best preschool or nanny, or maybe like starting to like teach them numbers and letters really early, and all these kinds of things. And my work is really kind of putting that stuff aside as well and sort of saying to parents like, listen, you can relax on all of that stuff. We really don't like the infant brain doesn't need any of that really. I mean, of course it needs high quality childcare, but all the other things it does not need.
The
And really,
academics, yeah.
yes, completely. And if we can just focus on the emotional development and equip parents with that information, I see it just shedding so much anxiety for parents because they're like, great, now I know exactly what's happening in my baby's brain and I know exactly how to show up, and I don't like just toss out all of that other stuff, all that other noise, that's around. So yeah, let's talk about it. So the reason why I always focus on the emotional brain and emotional care and the relationships between parents and babies is because the emotional brain in babies is developing and really craving that relationship and craving this to develop health. So, to date, every part of our brains that we know are really important for lifelong mental health. In my book, I talk about the most well-known and well-studied areas: the amygdala, hypothalamus, hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. These are the areas involved in our limbic HPA axis, our stress system. And our stress system is kind of like an umbrella to the health of all of our other mental health systems, our neurotransmitters, our gut health, and our social health and things like that. So when we understand this, how those brain parts develop and how to support them in a nurturing way, we're shaping them dramatically. And so, we can look at studies that have looked at high and low nurture in different animal models, and we see drastically different brains, like not just slightly different. They're really, really different. And that, includes like, their gross anatomy, like how big or small they are, what shape they're in. It includes the genetic expression inside, so how their genes are turned on and off. It includes how their proteins are expressed. So what is the content of these brain areas? And with high nurture, we see, really, really beautiful synchrony between all these brain areas. They're all built towards mental wellness, resilience, positive relationships, a healthy mind and body. And with low nurture, we see consistent results of, more reactive stress system, a tendency for more worry, fear, anxiety, depression, addiction, trouble with relationships, trouble learning. And so the research is really, really clear that, nurture is really constructing very, very different brains than low nurture.
Yeah. I would love for you to weave in this concept of independence to this whole picture, because I know you see probably exactly what I see, which is this overwhelming pressure for new parents to create independent babies, whether that's sleep, play, whatever.
Yep.
And yet doesn't really fit, right? Like, I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit through that neuroscience kind of angle.
Yeah, such a good topic, because I mean, the first thing I do with anything that parents are kind of talking about, and I do see that with almost every parent, is
Yes.
even like, and this is why it's important to dig into the root cause of things, because
Yeah.
even parents who are like coming to us with, oh, I really want to, really want to nurture my baby. I want to make a secure attachment. I want to help their brain in the most optimal way. They still grew up in low nurture culture. They still have these like very, very deep, strong beliefs, even though they're not
Yes.
consciously choosing them.
Yes, I see that too a lot.
And so they're coming to us like, I want to do all these great things. And then we talk about how to do it. And then eventually they're like, okay, well, then when do we get tough? Like, then when do we force the independence? Then when do we get all the support away? Because that fear has been implanted of, if you're responsive and caring and loving and close, you're spoiling, you're ruining independence, you're going to screw your kid up forever. And I think always going back, like, whose voice is that? Who said these things?
Yeah.
Is there any truth to them at all? That can help. And it can help parents when it comes up, because it will come up, because people around them will also bring it up. But they'll also bring it up inside, because we've just been conditioned like that so strongly, to be able to go back and be like, okay, where did this spoiling thing come from? Where did this independence thing come from? It came from, people who's like mostly doctors, mostly pediatricians at the very beginning of when medicine started in America, said it. And it was based on no scientific studies, no observation of children, no long-term health outcomes, no knowledge of the developing brain, no knowledge of infant mental health or parent mental health. And sort of just be like, okay, it's old. It's old. And maybe like that was the best for that time, but we're like 100 years later plus now. And we've had a genetic revolution, neuroscience revolution, all kinds of, scientific revolutions. The past 30, 40 years have been like, an exponential growth of data, right? You can see this, unbelievable growth in the number of papers published, and now we know more, right? We know a lot more. And none of it's true. The independence that we hope for and wish for, firstly, some of it's toxic in our low nurture culture. So we can question that. But we do obviously want, our kids to be able to function in society as best as possible. And so knowing that, like, when we are really interdependent from 0 to 3 and through childhood, giving being aware of like how much help and how much support our children are needing, and when we can encourage them to try things on their own with support, we grow independence, right? So some people call it a paradox, right? When we let our babies be, as dependent on us as they need, when I call it, they need to borrow our brains. They need to function with us in those early years. The more we lean into it and surrender to it and support it, the more independent, like the better chance they have at their independence later on.
Because you've given them that foundation.
Yeah, you give them that foundation of a regulated brain, and only a regulated brain can, be able to on its own, figure out challenges, figure out problem solving, all these things that are related to independence.
Okay, because you just said that, I have to go to self-soothing just really briefly because it
Yeah,
goes hand in hand, doesn't it? With low nurture culture and sleep training and that sort of toxic push for independence is the whole pressure to teach, in air quotes, self-soothing to babies.
Yes.
Let's unpack that for a few minutes.
Yeah, completely. And this is like, in that hardcore sleep training world. It's also in rye parenting
Oh my gosh, yes.
and a lot, like the other kinds of like Montessori derived
Uh-huh.
styles as well, which are seen by a lot of people as gentle, but not in this regard.
Yep.
And so, it's sort of this idea of independence, but taken to sleep, right? Where it's like
Mm-hmm.
babies have to learn to fall asleep alone. When they wake up in the middle of the night, they need to figure it out alone. And the idea there is they need it in order to be independent sleepers later, to have good sleep, in order to sleep well now and later for their health, right? And so parents are
Mm-hmm.
given all this information without really any informed choice of,
Mm-hmm.
is there an alternative? And that can be really, really difficult for parents and babies. And babies are just, I'll just say it plain, like not equipped to self-soothe. They don't have the brain parts developed to go from a state of high stress to low stress. They're not able to do it. And so they're actually going to sleep in a fear state. They are not going to sleep in a calm state, like a lot of the people who are talking about it would say.
Right, when you ignore the cry and then they stop crying and go to sleep, that's not necessarily a calm baby, or is definitely not a calm baby if they've been ignored to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I see the self-soothing one so much, even again with parents who want to show up and be responsive,
Mhm.
but that's another one with the independence. And it's like it's so burrowed into our subconscious,
Mhm.
right? That it's hard sometimes to unpack that out, even when you're consciously trying to choose other strategies and other approaches.
Mhm.
And then it doesn't help that, I don't know, I feel like in the US, at least, pediatricians are big on you gotta teach self-soothing. And so some of the things I hear from the parents that I work with, re-quoted from their pediatricians, just like are not good for my mental well-being,
Yeah,
let
and
alone the
they're
babies.
making up more things now.
I'm like, I've literally heard a client's pediatrician at their 9-month visit tell them that if they did not do cried out and teach their child how to self-soothe, they were undermining their child's ability to regulate their emotions for the rest of their life. And I'm just like, okay, flip that the exact
Oh,
opposite, basically. Like, oh my God.
yeah. Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. It's not right. It's not right. I mean, I'm hopefully gonna be able to reach some of those doctors. I'm starting to do some of that in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with hope, like that's my hope is to try to capture that audience, try to help pediatricians learn the new information.
Yeah, because when you get to the basics of how the brain is growing, it doesn't make sense. It literally just doesn't make sense. Whatever you think about, like how we support parents to get enough sleep or any of that kind of stuff, like it's just the biology of it. I wish it would stop presenting it like it is actually good for the biology of a baby rather
And
than, you know, I don't know, something
it's
else.
horrible. They're undermining sleep, healthy sleep, and healthy feeding in a lot of
Hmm.
cases. And they're completely in opposition to the doctor's goals. I believe that they believe that they are helping families, right? I think
Hmm.
that they think this is the way to healthy sleep and feeding. And I would hope that their goals are to give babies their best chance at life, the best brain and healthiest brain development possible, and encourage breastfeeding if people are wanting to do it.
Hmm.
But they're actually doing the opposite for both, and it's a big problem because it's really
Yeah.
hard to tell parents like don't listen to your doctor about those things. They are not trained in it. Like there's been studies on it. They really aren't trained in it unless they have taken some extra learning
Yep.
and to just the responsible thing to do is if they don't have training in it, to say, that's out of my scope. I'll send you to someone who's trained in that, right? Yeah. Yeah, but they don't do that.
No, not a lot of the time. Not a lot of the time, unfortunately.
Mm-mm.
Oh, wow. I want to be mindful of your time and the fact that I could probably ask you about 50,000 more questions. But let's wrap up with, what do you feel like is the most important thing for parents to be mindful of when we think about shifting to increasing our nurture in this brain infancy of the first 3 years? Like, what do you think the top 1 or 2 or 3 things
Yeah,
we should take away?
I think that when we can embrace nurture, there's people say like, oh, it's so much harder, it's so much work, right? Like I always say, like, anything that's like worth doing is hard. Anything, like, if something's easy, like, you're not gonna necessarily feel that reward so much. I would argue that nurturing a baby and your child, like wherever you're hearing this, it can start at any time. Cultivating that connection is the most rewarding, the most, transcendent experience that humans can have. And so I would say just give it a try. Try it. See what happens. See how you feel and give yourself that gift. You can always go back, right? You can try it as an experiment. Try the nurturing way for a little bit and see how it goes. And I just see the change in the parents I work with, where everything's hard, everything's a struggle, everything, is just so difficult when they're, in that realm of like rules and schedules and expectations and, behavior modification. And when they can exit that and get into the relationship with their baby and just exist in that relationship, it's just a beautiful shift of, wow, this is the most incredible thing that's ever happened to me. And of course, we said in the beginning of the podcast, like, it is equally, beautiful and moving and miraculous as it is difficult. But I would argue, having those moments that are so stunning in life, it's, that's why we're here, I think. It's so important. So I would say that's it. Give it a try. See how it goes.
I love that. I love that. Hard things are worth it, right?
Mhm.
And those moments of connections, they are so, so powerful. Well, thank you so much, Greer, for your time and your wisdom and your heart. Why don't you take a few minutes, share where folks can find you? I'll, of course, put all of that info in the show notes as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, people can find me on Instagram, Nurture Neuroscience Parenting, and my website is nurture-neuroscience.com. And I have lots of workshops. I'm now offering a workshop once a month and some one-on-one consultations as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope this episode left you feeling more informed, confident, and encouraged on your sleep journey. And just a reminder before you go that nothing in this episode is individualized to your specific sleep situation, nor is it to be taken as medical advice. Take what resonates, ignore what doesn't, and check with your healthcare provider about any medical concerns. Take a moment to subscribe to this podcast so that you'll never miss an episode. And take a moment to rate, review, or share an episode you love on social media. All of that helps parents just like you find me, this podcast, and this gentle and responsive sleep information. I'll see you next time.